All right, well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming to my talk this morning. Quick show of hands, I'm curious, how many people were at my talk yesterday? One? Okay, good. Oh, that's good, because I reuse a couple things, and I was just wondering. Well, my name is George Mandis, and I'm here today to talk about a project of mine that's almost 10 years old. I started it in 2009 called Konami-JS. And so my talk yesterday was about JavaScript and MIDI and music, and it was fun. It was very lighthearted, kind of goofy, kind of silly. And in a very similar vein, this project is somewhat silly. As you'll see when we look at the code, it's a very simple project. There's not a lot to it. But for whatever reason, because of the time that I started it and just chance, it became a surprisingly popular project and got used in a lot of places. And I just want to talk about what my experience has been like over the past almost 10 years. Managing a somewhat popular open source project that's completely frivolous and not very important. Because I think even though it's a silly project, there are fun takeaways from this experience. So a little bit about me. I'm a freelance full stack web developer from Portland, Oregon in the US. I've been doing it for about 11 years now, so I started this Konami project not very long after that. I feel like I need to emphasize this because it's just starting to really hit me this year, but 11 years is a really long time in tech, or it really feels that way. I think it's probably somewhere around 112 in technology years, at least in like front-end development years. I was looking at a list of all the things that did not exist back when I started in 2007 or so. And it was kind of an interesting list, so I wanted to show you this at the beginning. So when I started, iPhones didn't exist. Smartphones didn't exist. I remember if we wanted to make mobile websites, there was a technology called WAP that we would use specifically for cell phone browsers if you wanted to have web pages. And it was this whole other beast. It was its own thing. iPads obviously also didn't exist. It's worth pointing out they didn't exist for a solid 3 years or so after iPhones were introduced. So for the first 4 years or so of my development life, I didn't have to consider mobile or responsive design to any degree. It wasn't something that was even on my radar, I should say. So that's kind of interesting to look back and think about. App stores, that's kind of a funny one to put in there, but I think the way app stores are structured has really profoundly changed the way we value and charge for our services and software. I remember the only things that were 99 cents used to be ringtones for your phones and like songs you would download on iTunes and things like that. And the idea of 99-cent or free apps just seemed crazy to me, and honestly still kind of does seem crazy for a completely different reason. Node.js, so JavaScript lived entirely in the browser at that point. Server-side JavaScript did come along for a while. And the JavaScript of 2007 was not the JavaScript that we use today in many, many ways. It was not even the JavaScript I would come to use like 3 or 4 years later. React and Angular, not specifically just those two frameworks, but these very, just very complicated JavaScript frameworks that are very popular now and sort of taking over the industry. We didn't have anything like that on the front end back then that I was aware of. When I started my career, it was actually slightly before jQuery came out, if you can believe that. I remember when jQuery came out and I was like, oh my God, this fixes all these problems. And it's kind of funny because it's almost come full circle and jQuery is almost passé, and vanilla JavaScript has come so far, we don't necessarily need to use it in a really simple one-off project. But that actually surprised me because I couldn't remember if I'd actually started before jQuery came out. When I looked that up, it's interesting because in some ways that really profoundly set the tone for how browsers would design their own APIs to interact with the DOMs, things like that. And then this one also, basic console logging. Although we used to use a plugin called Firebug with Firefox. Does anyone remember that? Okay, good. Yeah, thank God. Yeah. I mean, I remember I didn't discover that for about a month or so into my freelancing career, and I was using alert functions to let me know when certain parts of the script fired and whatnot, and it was kind of absurd. So that's just a short list of things that have shown up in my 11-year career, just to put in context what my experience was like before I started this project. Oh yeah, so I look at that list and I look at all the new things that come out, and you have to constantly sort of stay on top of the ball and learn new technologies, and sometimes it kind of makes me feel like this, even though I'm not very old. I don't know if you can tell, but it's a bunch of dinosaur bones. Anyway, I'll be real quick about this. Since none of you are at my talk, well, one of you was at my talk, I think, yesterday. There's some repeats on this list, but they'll be new to you. So a little bit about me, just to sort of humanize developers, which I think is useful. This is my first time in Ukraine. It's very lovely here. I lived as a digital nomad in 18 different countries for a year. It's kind of an interesting story. I used to work as an application developer for an NBA team. I have a lot of interesting stories about that, even though it was a very short stint in my life. I'm not a computer science major, which is not so uncommon, but I'm actually not a technology major at all at the university. Right now I'm teaching a class back home. I'm teaching a coding boot camp, and that's a frequent question that comes up. Do you need a computer science degree? Do you need a degree in technology? I like to tell people, it doesn't hurt, and it probably would have helped certain things, but it's not strictly required to have a career in technology. I once unintentionally cheated while I was running a marathon in North Korea, which is, I do not advocate cheating in general, but if you're going to pick a country to cheat in, I would suggest choosing a different one. And my best known project, as we're going to talk about today, is a little thing called Konami-JS. I'm curious, before you read about Konami-JS on the door, or maybe in the pamphlet, how many of you had actually heard of Konami-JS in this room? I'm curious. Okay, a few of you, okay. That's about what I expected. Like I said, it is moderately popular. I know it's been used by hundreds and actually probably in the thousands of people. It's been used by some very surprisingly big names in certain places, but it's such a goofy and inconsequential script, as we'll see. It's not an open source project most people will have heard of. So what is Konami.js? It's, simply put, it is an Easter egg script that I made back in 2009. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with the concept of what an Easter egg is. Quick show of hands. Okay, actually not too many. So just to be clear, an Easter egg is like a secret hidden feature, whether that's on your website or in a video game. It's something that is not immediately obvious when you get there, but through a special way of interacting with the thing, it triggers a special feature that you can now access. It's kind of like a secret, basically. Who's familiar with the Konami code? Quick show of hands. Okay, so Konami.js, what Konami.js does is it implements the Konami code on a website. So when the Konami code is entered onto the website, it will trigger something special. That's the Easter egg. And the Konami code, well, there was a company back in the 1980s, 1990s called Konami, and they used to make Nintendo games. And on most of their Nintendo games, there was a special sequence that you could put on the controller. That sequence went up, up, down, down, left, right, B, and then A. And if you were a 10-year-old kid in like 1992, you had that memorized, and anytime you were playing a Konami game, you would enter that at the beginning just to see what it did and see what happened in the game. For whatever reason, I think maybe just because of like the age at which the web has developed, and because a lot of people who are developing for the web now grew up around the same time I did, and they also played Nintendo, there was a trend around 2009 where people started implementing the Konami code in websites. Specifically, there were two real high-profile cases in 2009 where some big names put the Konami code on their website. You'd enter that sequence then using the keyboard, up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A. And then something really goofy would just happen on the page. Facebook, on Facebook's, a lens flare would show up on the website. And I think that was a big deal because the Star Trek movie had just come out and everyone was talking about how lens flares were like everywhere in that movie. The other one was ESPN. You entered the Konami code and then suddenly a bunch of unicorns would just show up on the page. Does anyone remember this? I'm curious. Probably not. So I saw both of those and I thought, well, that's kind of funny. Maybe I should add the Konami code to my site. It doesn't seem that hard. I just track the keys and whatnot. And I'm like, well, I'm going to do that some weekend. So I set aside a day and I wrote a nice little script. And I just a year before purchased an iPhone, which was really exciting and a big deal. And I thought, well, would it be really cool if I could also simulate this on my iPhone somehow? And so I looked up the APIs at the time for touch events and all that business. And I made it so I made a little script that enabled the Konami code on an ordinary keyboard and also on the iPhone using gestures. Obviously, the A and the B wasn't quite accurate. It was more like up, up, down, down, left, right, tap, tap is what it ended up being, but I thought that was close enough. And so after a day, I came up with this code, which I know you cannot read, and I just threw it in here to demonstrate that it's not a lot of code. Oh, actually, I have to scroll over here. You can't see that. Okay. It's not a tremendous amount of code, but it does the job. And implementing it, so after I thought it would be nice if I could write this code and implement it in a way so that if other people want to put the Konami code on their site, all they have to do is link to this library I made and put one little line on their website. Because back in 2009, I feel like more people used to do that with JavaScript. And so after you include that file in your project, all you have to do is include this one little line. Create an Easter egg variable, create a new instance of the Konami object, and you pass a URL as a string to a website that you want to redirect to. So my thought was that can be the Easter egg, that can be the secret. If you enter this special combination of keys, it'll redirect you to some kind of hidden website. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. Maybe you want to do something fancier though, like if we want to add unicorns to the page or a lens flare or make everything turn upside down or do something kind of crazy. And so I edited the script so I can either pass a string if I don't want to do too much with it. That's it. Or I can pass a function if I want to do something else. And now that I'm passing a function, I can do pretty much anything I want within that. In this case, I'm just using a simple alert, make it a little bit more complicated. And so, I packaged this up and I thought that's kind of nice. Maybe I can also add some other features. Maybe people want to trigger different types of Easter eggs when they're on mobile versus when they're on the desktop. Or maybe they want to have multiple kinds of Easter eggs. Even as I was thinking about this, I thought this is pretty useless. I don't think anyone's going to actually do it, but it's a fun exercise. The product may be geeky and kind of useless, but the process of developing it and exploring it along the way is still really valid, and you learn a lot of stuff with these kind of things. And so I edited it a little bit, and I made it so you can change the pattern. In this case, we changed it to just hitting the up arrow 10 times. And I also changed it so that when you're on an iPhone, you get a completely different message than when you're on the desktop and you get one message. So I just kept adding and adding, and eventually we got this surprisingly robust but still very silly script that would let you implement the Konami code in probably any way I can imagine anyone would possibly want to on their website. And so I wrote this script and I thought, this is kind of nice. I should probably share it with people so that people might actually use it. I could put it on my website, but not a lot of people go there. I should probably put it on some publicly hosted source code place. So back in 2009, what were my options? First of all, I got to choose a version control system. So I thought, well, what should I use? Git had come out about 4 years before at that time, and it was invented by Linus, as everyone knows, the inventor of Linux. And for that reason alone, I thought, well, that's probably legit. I should probably be using that. But at the same time, when I go out there and I look at these other websites, I see Subversion everywhere. I feel like although Git is clearly the direction it's going, maybe I should be using Subversion, I don't know. And Mercurial is another one that I remember hearing about. I kind of tossed those three up and I'm like, well, I should choose one of these. I'm not sure which one. And then I thought, well, where am I going to host it? That's the other thing. GitHub in 2009 was only 1 year old. And it looked really cool and it looked really hip, but it had only been around for a year. Google Code had been around a little bit longer at that time. And because it was Google, and back then I guess had it seemed like Google could pretty much crush any competitor they wanted to and didn't seem to make many mistakes back in 2009. They seemed like a pretty solid choice to go with. And then SourceForge was something that I also remember spending a surprising amount of time on back then looking for open source projects. So those were, at the time, I kind of thought were my options. I ended up going with Subversion and Google Code to host my project initially. After about a year, I changed to Git and GitHub, which we'll see in a second. So there's a snapshot of what the homepage still looks like. It's been archived because Google Code got sunsetted a couple years ago, although it was a ghost town for like 5 years before that, I think. And it was a minor success. I put it out in the public, and people actually started downloading it and using it. And I would get emails from people, and I set up a little Google alert to tell me when people were using the Konami code. And I was surprised every day I get a few more pings. And issues were actually being created and solved on the project page. Bugs were being found and squashed. The code was improved upon. People gave suggestions, and it was actually out there living in the wild. So eventually I moved to GitHub, like I said, about a year later. And the reason I did that is because it was clear that's where the people were. It was getting more and more popular. I kept hearing more and more about it. I had already switched from Subversion to Git just because that seemed like a much better choice for my workflow and things at the time. And Git, I think at that time GitHub obviously had gone all in on using Git as their version control, and Google Code had just somewhat recently adopted it. It seemed kind of late to the game. They also had a much better user experience for just generally exploring other open source projects out there, and I think that actually has a lot to do with some of their success and the reason a particular open source project might or might not pick up traction. So I moved to GitHub, and then it got used even more. It really skyrocketed. People started sending me more pull requests and issues and emailing me, and my Google alert that I had set up started pinging more and more times. And I saw it in really interesting places. Most of it was a lot of self-hosted blogs, people who were just trying to learn JavaScript, and that was pretty cool because it's the kind of script that would really appeal to a beginner. Lots of personal websites and things like that. I saw a surprising number of like small agencies and web design companies had thrown it on there as sort of a geeky secret. One had used it as a way to find a job board that was hidden on their site, which was kind of funny. Some people use it as a testing tool. So if they wanted to go into like test mode on the website and test out certain features, you would enter the Konami code and then certain flags would be set and things would change. I found it once on a Black Hat hacking forum, which concerned me a lot, and I tried not to focus on that too much. And then one day, I got a really interesting one, and I found out Marvel was using it. I got a ping on, and Newsweek, I got a ping on Twitter from this man. And he said, hey, I wonder what happens if you enter the Konami code on the front page of marvel.com. So I went and I entered it, because I didn't know, I hadn't quite found out yet. And this little guy pops up on the screen, or used to, back in 2010 at this point, I should say. And I was really excited because that was easily the most high-profile use of my code out in the wild that I'd seen. And I thought, well, that's really cool. I mean, I can't exactly take credit for it, but it's something I built that someone is using in a place that's really cool. And I thought, wow, that's really great. And then, you know, about a year later, there was I learned about this. There was the developers at Newsweek had used my code, had used Konami-JS to implement a test feature where all of the articles on the website were replaced with zombies. And I remember hearing about that, of all things, through an article on Forbes that had been written about this for whatever reason. I think it blew up on Twitter that day, and this guy in Forbes wrote about it. And way down here, you can't really read it, but it says, the code itself is a straight lift of the Konami JavaScript library put together by George Mandis. And I thought that was really funny, so I'd send people to this article and say, have you seen my Forbes article? So again, like minor successes, but it was still kind of fun to see a very trivial open source project go like that. A quick public service announcement, going back to Marvel. So I was very excited when that was released. And so one of the things I immediately did is I thought, oh, there are all these rough edges on the project I really want to fix right now. So I got in there, I made a quick change, and I pushed it up to GitHub. And what I didn't realize is Marvel had been kind of using the GitHub repository like a CDN. They were linking directly to it. And I didn't really test the change. I just kind of did it. I pushed it up there. And then I went back to marvel.com to see how it looked. And the entire website was just completely screwed up and broken and useless. And I looked at the console real quick and I was like, oh shit, I think I broke their website. And so I quickly reverted the changes. And so it's just a quick public service announcement. It doesn't happen so much now, but back then I think people used to link somewhat more often, like directly to the raw source on GitHub. Don't do that, because you might be linking to someone's project like me, who's kind of an idiot sometimes and just pushes things willy-nilly without testing them, and then your very big website will crash for some silly reason. So the project got kind of popular, and I started asking myself some questions like, what kind of license should I be using? Is there any way I can make money off of this? What else should this script do? Should I be adding features? And to give these, I don't have great answers to these, to be honest. I mean, my quick answers are whatever license. I changed licenses a few times. I started with the GPL2, and then I changed to GPL3 because I figured 3 must be better than 2. I didn't really know anything about it. And then eventually I settled on the MIT license just because it seemed to be what everyone else was using. It's what jQuery used. I thought, well, it's probably good enough. I don't really know what these mean to some extent. I settled on that after someone in the raised an issue with the license I had chosen and said he would not use my project because of the license, which kind of made sense to me, but still. I can definitely answer the second one. The answer is no. You probably cannot make money off a project like this. But the third question, what else should I do? That actually led to kind of an interesting place because it made me realize, as the project became more popular, I got lots of requests for pull requests and requests for features to be added and things to be changed. And I kind of realized like what makes a good open source project. And that's having your own set of like guidelines and goals and idea for the direction for what the project should be. Like it's a goofy project, but my one goal in all of it was whatever pull request you make, I don't want the file to get any larger. I don't want it to get any more complicated. This is what it does. It should be simple. Just don't make it more complicated. Oops. Okay. Yeah, and for that reason, like I ended up rejecting a lot of pull requests. I had some people, I had lots of requests to integrate with sort of the package manager of the day, going back all the way to 2011. It's actually really interesting to look back at that and see which ones stuck around and which ones didn't, and which ones would have been worth my time to implement earlier, and which ones I'm kind of glad I didn't because it would have been a pain to undo the changes required to integrate with that. The other thing that I got a request for once was including a CoffeeScript version of the code, which was cool. And that goes to the fourth point on this one. It's important to recognize when something is better served as a fork and not a feature. One person asked, hey, you know, I have a version of this that's supposed to integrate with like my joystick and uses the joystick or the gamepad API in my browser. And I thought, well, that's great. Go ahead and make your own fork and do it, and I'll link to it. I don't want to make this any more complicated than it is. And I think setting those guidelines and rules actually, in a roundabout way, even though it's a very small project, made me a good steward of this open source project. So some things I noticed managing a smallish project on GitHub. You'll get a lot of PR requests for things that really have nothing to do with your code, like fixing your semicolons and spaces and things, depending how haphazardly you've thrown it together. That's actually kind of great for someone like me. GitHub is a little bit of a popularity contest, so you will get people just making pull requests for the sake of having contributed to something or wanting to make a change for the sake of a change. It's kind of interesting. You'll also, because my script in particular, I think appealed to beginners, you will get a lot of people who are learning coming into the fray, trying to make contributions or understand why something doesn't work. And you end up troubleshooting a lot of problems that, you know, maybe aren't really problems with the code, but it's still kind of interesting. I get a lot of requests to integrate with different package managers and loaders and things like that, and it's really interesting to see just how much that has dominated the scene over the past like 10 years or so. I have a lot of thoughts about that. Sometimes people just like to debate things. The one about the license was interesting. There was a thread about what the Konami code actually was. It used to be, we used to have enter as the very last key, and then after some debate we decided it should end with B and A and leave enter off. But it was funny to me that we had a discussion about it, and it was like a thing. And like I already said at the top, though, a surprising number of issues will have nothing to do with your code directly. It'll be more about features that should be added, the way things are implemented, what sort of things could be implemented better, but not in a way that's like directly suggested. It's kind of interesting. The other thing that I noticed in managing this project is you'll discover some interesting like edge cases. So one issue that was raised was there's a line in Konami-JS that just detects what key was pressed, and we use key code. There's actually a lot of code I could probably remove at this point because it used to account for like older versions of Internet Explorer, but whatever, it still works. I left it in there. So there's this line, and someone raised an issue on GitHub, and they said, well, according to MDN, that's supposed to be deprecated. We're supposed to be using these other features now. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Let me go look at it. And I looked, and I read the documentation. I think she was right. And so I looked at what I was supposed to be using, and I tried changing the code a little bit to use what I was supposed to be using. And to be fair, this was 2 years ago now. I should probably test this again. But at the time, there was less support for the standard features. I mean, I'm sorry, the standard way of detecting a key press than this one, which has been deprecated for a long time. This one will work in all browsers, and the way that you're supposed to do it doesn't. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird because I don't know what to do in this case, because this person is technically right, and we should be pushing the standard forward, but I also just want this thing to work, so I'm going to leave it the way it is. So, I mean, that's just an interesting example of like the kind of what I call rabbit holes, just things you don't even think about on the surface that you end up getting bogged down in, the kind of minutia that can rise up from even a very simple and kind of silly project like this. So I'm almost out of time here, but here are my takeaways from managing this smaller project. I encourage everyone to make stuff and publish it, even if it's silly and trivial like mine was. You never know who might find it and pick it up. It might be useful. It might be something you're talking about in front of people 10 years later in another country. You never know. Encourage people to engage. Even though I reject a lot of pull requests, I always thank them for their time, and I often encourage people to make forks using that new feature, that new implementation that they've suggested. I think you don't want to shoot people down, particularly if you have a project like this one where it caters to beginners in particular. Don't include everything that speaks to the package managers thing, just include the right things. Be very wary of linking your code too heavily, making it too heavily dependent on something that may or may not be there in the next 5 years. And you can't make everyone happy. That's just a good lesson for life, honestly. That's the end of my talk. Spasiba. My name is George Mandis, as I said at the top.